¿Bien? Será quien nos presenta. Él viene por parte de Terra Global también, ¿verdad? Y nos expondrá el siguiente tema. Por favor, doctor. Creo que se lo dejé a su tamaño.
Gracias. Now, I think we have a bit of residual marketing here from the UNDP guys. They've decided that they want to keep themselves in front of mind. So you're going to have to accept as I move through my presentation that we're going to have a bit of UNDP there. So I guess I need to give you a bit of background on myself. I started life, I guess, as a risk manager for Australia's largest pension fund, where I got interested in environmental markets. I went back and did a PhD. And then, like all good Australians do nowadays, I ended up in the US doing a postdoc. And I worked with IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute, and the World Bank. Then I went back to Australia to work on the cap and trade program that is now defunct. I was Director of International Emissions Trading there, and also Director of Carbon Market Operations in the Australian Climate Change Regulatory Authority. So I've got a background in cap and trade, a lot of the technical issues, and I guess what we're going to do today is try and move on a little bit from the fixed dollar funds that we've been talking about for most of the morning. So let's move on to the first slide. So this is just an overview of the talk. We're going to talk about the range of actions affecting demand in the market at the moment. I'm going to do a bit of a market overview. We're going to specifically spend a bit of time on voluntary markets because they're interesting, they're functional, and there are quite a few lessons we can learn from them. I will touch briefly on funds. I'm not going to spend much time on the funds, but it's part of the demand picture, so we need to revisit it briefly. And then I'm going to focus primarily on compliance markets and what we might get out of those markets as they develop. And then there will be some wrap-up comments on supply and demand characteristics and a brief look at what we could expect in the future. So this is a taxonomy of existing emissions reductions policies. Now, I want to take this with me because there are a lot of international actions out there that are being undertaken. And this particular audit came up with over 1,000 different actions being undertaken to reduce emission reductions. And it's something that's important to keep in mind as we move through this. There are a lot of things being done in the international marketplace. Now, let's have a look. So this is where we've been. We've been talking about direct government expenditure, and this is where we're going. We're going to be talking more about explicit carbon prices. So can I just whip around the room and just get an idea, just if you could put up your hand if you're familiar with cap and trade schemes, just so I get an idea of how much background we've got. Okay, a little bit on cap and trade. What about baseline and credit? Anybody? Bit on baseline and credit. How about carbon taxes? A little bit on carbon taxes. And what about intensity targets? Intensity targets, US and China. And lastly, of course, offsetting. Offsetting should be something you guys all know about with Costa Rica. So yeah, not too much. All right. Well, so to just give you an idea, the key things we work with allowances. We have supply, demand, and price. So if we have cap and trade, cap and trade fixes what? Does it fix demand? Any suggestions? Does cap and trade fix price? Well, it fixes supply. We fix the supply of allowances. We say there's an absolute cap on the total volume of emissions. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because the volume of offsets that they allow into a scheme is a proportion of the cap. So it's a proportion of the cap. So we let the market determine, the market obviously determines demand and price falls out. So, that should be for cap and trade. So I'll put that up there. A carbon tax. What do we do with a carbon tax? What do we fix? Any suggestions? Price. That's right. So we're fixing the price on the carbon tax. Now that means if it's fixed price, what we tend to do is we limit the total volume that you can buy to the total volume of emissions. So if the price is low, so it has no effect on changing behaviour and reducing the carbon emissions, you will just simply buy credits or pay your tax up until you've exhausted all your individual emissions. So demand and supply are sorted out. We're fixing the price. So now we have baseline and credit. Oops. So I think that one's a little bit more complicated because what they do is I have emissions and they'll have maybe production volume or some other factor that they're wanting to look at. And the companies will all have different values of production and emissions. And we fit some sort of baseline to this. And we say the companies below the baseline, they get credits for the amount that they're below the baseline, and then the companies above the baseline have to buy those credits. And that creates supply and demand in the market, and hence a price at which supply and demand balance. And lastly, I guess we should talk about intensity targets. Now, does anybody have a view on whether there's any supply, demand or price with intensity targets? Well, of course, there is an informal carbon price because you're causing a change in behaviour, and it's not explicit, but you can make it explicit if you give a mass-based target, because you can convert an emissions intensity target into a mass-based number, and you can allow trading, which is effectively what the US is going to do and China is doing at the moment. So that's just a very quick introduction into the basics, and I'm happy to provide more background information for those who would like to talk about it more. So this is an overview of the market as it stands. We have compliance demand, which can come from cap and trade, taxes, intensity targets, baseline and credit. And I'm missing the little offsets, because offsets are actually quite important in this scheme. It's a bit of an omission on my part. We have the funds, the bilateral and multilateral funds that you heard about today. We have voluntary markets. So the next 4 slides are just going to focus on the voluntary markets and what we can learn from those. Now, one of the key things about voluntary markets is there's a lot of fragmentation, and that fragmentation starts with the reasons individuals and corporate entities buy offsets in the voluntary market. Now, there are a lot of reasons, a lot of buyer motivations for participation in the offset market. Now, that might seem strange, but this market is real, it exists, and there are active participants in it who want to offset for a variety of reasons. And I think offset resale is really just speculators or intermediaries who are picking up offsets to supply to their end users. You have direct purchases from companies usually that are interested in promoting a climate-driven mission. You have corporate social responsibility, which is a significant factor, CSR purchases. And then we get down into some smaller numbers with demonstrated climate leadership in industry and policy and engagement with customers on offsets and emissions. The key point here is there are a lot of reasons to buy voluntary offsets. Now, if we look at the standards that voluntary offsets use, this is another story of fragmentation. You have the verified carbon standard. In this picture, we have Chicago Climate Exchange, which is now closed. There's some carbon farming initiative, which is interesting because it's out of the Australian scheme, and I'm not sure what volumes there will be going forward. And there are other standards here. But the dominant standard is VCS. So you have a lot of fragmentation, but there is a dominant standard. Now, this picture is to give you an idea, an important idea that the voluntary market, within the voluntary market, there are a lot of different project types that compete with the project type that you're most interested in, which is REDD+. So we started with a story of fragmentation. We've seen that there are fragmented reasons why buyers buy, there are fragmentation over the types of standards that are used. And here, if you like, there's a lot of fragmentation in the sense of the vast number of different types of project-based opportunities out there for emissions reductions. Now, what that means in practice is there's a lot of substitution. So using that old economic term, if the price is right, people will buy forest carbon credits. If it's too high, you will see switching to other offset project types. So what this picture does here is give you a bit of an idea of the current state of play. So this is volume and price, and what it's showing you is the bulk that currently in the market for REDD+ credits, the market is below $6, right? So this is where the bulk of the market is, and this particular volume number here is driven partly by KfW's ACRE deal. So this is to give you a bit of an idea that the prices are low. It's commonly agreed the market's in oversupply. And what we're seeing though is, as the prices fall in this market, there's been a doubling in purchases because preferentially buyers prefer REDD+ because of the co-benefits that it offers. So if the price is right, it wins in competition with all the other project types. So I think they're four kind of important observations that come out of the voluntary market. So I'll just quickly, any quick questions for clarification before I plough on? Okay. So we've spoken about voluntary markets. Now we have to look at funds again very briefly. So as you've seen, the funds are, you've got your multilateral funds, BICF, FCPF, you have the bilateral funds. We haven't really discussed Norway, we haven't really discussed REM, and we haven't really discussed Japan. But I am going to talk a little bit about them in the next slide. So this is kind of a busy slide, but this comes out of some work I'm doing with Leslie at the moment on supply and demand. Now, I put up a particular structure, and I just want to clarify how this works. In our economic modelling, what we've done is we've divided the demand picture into what we've called status quo, which is demand from sources we're very confident of. So they're least risk or least uncertainty, most certain demand, but they're also the lowest demand numbers. Then we have what we call a moderate growth scenario. The moderate growth scenario, what that what that offers is a concept of expanded demand as a result of compliance markets, and the way in which compliance markets potentially in the near term may generate demand. So we'll be looking a little bit later at California and the US CPA's Clean Air Act Section 111, which both have great potential in this market. And then we have something called Blue Sky, which is our most optimistic view of the world, but of course it's the most uncertain, even because it's the highest level of demand and it's predicated on a broadly based international agreement. So the things to observe here are that Norway is a pretty significant current component of the demand picture. So if we look at nested within each of the status quo, moderate growth and Blue Sky, we've got sub-scenarios of low, mid and high to give you an idea of the potential range of outcomes that might occur. Now, the thing to take out of this is that Norway is a driver. Now, for Latin America, Norway is really not a driver going forward, because these numbers come out of the $1 billion promise to Indonesia, which so far hasn't resulted in any payments yet for. The second thing to notice is Japan, and Japan may be the joint crediting mechanism from Japan may well be something that is worth exploring. Now, so far in the REDD+ area, they only have one project potential agreement in place with Indonesia, and given that Indonesia is not delivering on its payment for results to Norway, it seems unlikely that the Japanese equivalent of that program is going to be quickly delivered either. So this picture from a Latin American point of view may not offer a great amount of demand from those two sources, but I still think Japan is something that's worth potentially following up. The red early movers, we've got a fairly low numbers in there. We haven't included the deal that's being done with Colombia because we haven't been able to get any details on the volumes that are likely to be in that. And of course, we've got the voluntary market sitting over the top. And this gives you an idea of the demand. Now, this picture here tries to give you an indication of what is happening to demand between 2015 and 2025. And basically, it is going to fall off if we don't start seeing demand coming out of the Green Climate Fund. So this is something I think you should all be concerned about, in that you do want to make sure that we don't see a declining demand from this kind of base status quo scenario. So the next thing for us to look at is really global GHG markets. So we have baseline and credit, and the only example I know of that's really operating as a compliance scheme is Alberta. Have cap and trade. There's the defunct Australian scheme that I'm a refugee from. There's the EU ETS, which there's no demand in compliance period 3, and there's not going to be any international credits allowed in the next compliance period. California is really interesting, which we're going to discuss. Korea potentially, Quebec in conjunction maybe with California. Offsetting, we've got aviation, Costa Rica, maybe marine bunker fuels. Taxes, we're going to just look at Mexico here because I think it's kind of an interesting case study. And then intensity targets. I'm not going to talk about China. My point is, but I will talk a little bit about US EPA because I think that's got some interesting ramifications for the region. So let's move on to California. So for those of you who are not familiar with what's happening in California, California has a cap and trade scheme. We've got a number of Californians here who can probably talk in more detail than I can on this, but it has At the moment, there's a mix of free allocations and auctioning. What that means is the allowances are partially auctioned and partially given away for free. There are 3 compliance periods. Currently, REDD Plus is not yet eligible, but I think the expectation is that it will be eligible in at least the 3rd phase. Would that be right, Leslie?
I think people are still hopeful, and it's got the one line in the red, but there's been no rulemaking started yet.
Right. So this is a possibility. In terms of the offset percentage, they allow 8% of the cap to be offsets. Half of that in the 3rd compliance period, so 4% potentially come from REDD+. And it covers, basically it's going to cover 85+% of the emissions from California. So it's a big scheme. So what we have here is a picture from our moderate growth scenario, which tries to estimate what might happen as a result of compliance moves. And what I think the interesting things to focus on are North America, because if California moves forward and then some other changes that result from the Clean Air Act, we're likely to see some reasonable demand coming out of North America for REDD+. The other area that I think is really interesting is Asia, and largely the numbers here are being driven by the fact that Australia is going to have a significant shortfall in meeting its emissions target. So there is possibly a reasonable potential that they will want to purchase REDD+ credits at some point to balance the books. So I think there's an interesting story here. Now I'm going to have a quick look at these other numbers, but I wondered if people could put up their hands and give me an indication of if from your countries which one of if you have, I'm interested in if you have a national aviation carrier. No, I've got Qantas. So British Airways. Yes. So others, do other people have domestic or national carriers, flag carriers, airlines? Right. So have you ever considered that aviation could be a driver of REDD+ demand? So here, what we're seeing is REDD+ demand in an aviation agreement. So what might that look like? So interestingly enough, the International Civil Aviation Organisation, ICAO, and the International Air Transport Association have all got on the same page, and they're looking at an offset market by 2020 to offset all future aviation emissions. This has got really great potential demand opportunities for REDD+, because if it's an offset market, they're going to want to get offsets as efficiently and cheaply as possible, but they're also going to be very interested in the co-benefits. And as long as the price is right, they are likely to preferentially purchase REDD+ credits. So I think this is an area that is well worth exploring from your national perspectives, and certainly working with the aviation industry to develop a coherent international position on how you would like to see REDD+ incorporated within any international agreement. So we're going to have a quick look at Mexico. Mexico introduced a carbon tax in 2014. Currently, there are no REDD+ offset opportunities in it. That doesn't mean that there won't be. I think one of the really great things about the Mexican scheme at the moment, even though the price is low, it's probably not going to generate a lot of emission reductions. But in the future, there's potential, of course, as the price increases to reduce emissions. But the best part of it is the Treasury there estimates $1 billion of revenue to the public coffers. So polluters pay and the community will benefit from carbon tax revenues. So there's a great opportunity to utilise this model to enhance your own domestic financial revenues, at the same time make a contribution to reducing emissions. So I think Mexico is very interesting. This picture I've just put up, it's a little bit hard to see, but what they've done is they've estimated for different fossil fuels the content of CO2, and then they've applied a tax rate to the content of fossil fuels in those different fuel types. And what's very interesting here is they've used this, in my opinion, this is purely an opinion, to try to encourage the development of natural gas industry, which is again a sort of a energy resource security issue, where they're trying to encourage the development of and use of natural gas. So that has a zero tax rate at the moment. So let's look at the US. So what is happening in the US is that there are currently proposals on new power plants, modified power plants, and existing power plants. And the existing power plant proposal is called the Clean Power Plan. And this has come out of one of President Obama's initiatives. And the idea behind this is that states are set a energy intensity goal that they have to reach by 2030. Now, the analysis says nationwide by 2030, this rule would reduce CO2 emissions from the power sector by approximately 30% over 2005 levels. So that's a pretty significant change in the behaviour of growing emissions in the US. Now, this plan does not allow offsets. But the interesting thing here is the response that the different states will take to the plan. And there are really three basic strategies states can have. They join California or adopt a California-like plan, which would mean you have a cap and trade plan, which has the potential for you to import international offsets, such as REDD+. So I would be expecting that there will be some states that will join with California, including Quebec, could generate additional demand from this move. Now, you may or may not be familiar with the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is northeastern states in the US. In our assessment, we don't think that there is going to be any offset demand there. And they have a CO2 only cap and trade program. So it's narrowly based and only the power sector, whereas California's covers all, pretty much all sectors, 85% coverage. And then lastly, of course, the final strategy is that they're going to follow Colorado. And what Colorado has done is it's simply closing down its coal-fired power stations to replace it with natural gas-fired stations. So I think this is really potentially a game changer and something to be watched very closely, because it could have ramifications for a demand effect in the future. Which leads me to the future outlook, and one of the things that could be a ramification from what's happening with the EPA proposal is that I come back to this 1,000+ actions that are around the world, and 300 of those actions are currently in the United States. So what you're seeing in the US is a massive fragmentation of different policies and approaches right across the US to deal with climate change. Now, one of the responses would be that industry ultimately will lobby for a more unified, coherent national approach. And what we've done in the blue sky scenario here is build in just such an outcome. This is modelled on the Waxman-Markey climate bill that was introduced to the House back in 2010. And we've got a a series of optimistic demand here. But I think that the important thing is that going forward there is, if the world in aggregate does decide to get serious about climate change, we're likely to see significant demand for REDD+ from that decision to move forward. Now, what I've done as well is I've looked at the UNFCCC, and we've tried to estimate what a UNFCCC agreement would produce if we were targeting 2%, highly confidently targeting the 2% and moderately confidently targeting it. And we've calibrated this on IPCC data. And, you know, it comes out to be fairly close to the blue sky analysis, which is good. But what I think the observation here that's important is that your demand for REDD+ is going to come from these domestic abatement programs. It is very important to have REDD+ in the UNFCCC agreement, but that agreement in and of itself is not going to generate the demand. The demand is going to come from the inclusion of REDD+ credits within the domestic schemes, which leads on to the final slide, and it will ultimately lead on to the final point. And I just want to cap off the talk by re-emphasising that there's a lot of there's a lot of fragmentation in this market. The supply of REDD+ credits will compete with other offset types, so price is going to be important. While the market is currently oversupplied, if we start to look forward, if any of these significant areas of demand come online, there's a great opportunity to ramp up the supply. But we do need clearer commitments. And the final point really is to drive home the idea that we need, one of the principal reasons you really need REDD+ in the UNFCCC agreement is that most of the triggers in domestic policy for the inclusion of international offsets require that it's an approved international offset. Now, I've spent vast amounts of my time on this one issue, and if there's anything that I'm more convinced of than ever, you will not, if it's not an approved international offset, it will not be imported into the domestic schemes, and the domestic schemes will be the schemes that will actually drive the demand. So the countries like Australia, countries like the US with a high marginal cost of abatement are going to will want to use REDD, but they will want it to be part of a broader international framework so that there is some credibility brought to the inclusion of, to the use and inclusion of these offsets. So under the Australian scheme, we're very happy to import CDM credits, but because there was no REDD+, we incorporated, our wording was to approved international credits in the future, which might have included REDD+. So that gives you a bit of an overview of the demand picture going forward. I'm happy to take questions. I hope you have all got something out of this presentation, and so feel free to ask me some questions, but let me put on my my headset.
Yo tengo una pregunta y tomaría lo último que indicaste. Definitivamente el mercado voluntario también responde a lo que va pasando en la negociación, ¿no? Internacional, en el marco de la convención. En la medida en que haya más certeza de que REDD finalmente va a ser aprobado, eso, digamos, va a mover mercado voluntario también, o al menos, digamos, eso es lo que uno esperaría. Ahora, viendo ese vínculo, los países, o más bien dicho, los actores de mercado voluntario están siguiendo, digamos, algunas directrices mínimas en términos de los marcos metodológicos que deben usar los países para promover esa articulación En otras palabras, digamos, cómo evitar que haya en algún momento algún desajuste entre lo que se promueve vía mercados voluntarios, pensemos BCS u otros mecanismos, contra lo que la convención está requiriendo. O sea, o si no existe, digamos, alguna sugerencia que deban seguir los países para poder hacer esa articulación.
Thank you. It's a good question, and I think it is important to realise there will be pre-compliance activity if and when, the closer we get to the inclusion of REDD in a UNFCCC agreement, the more likely you're going to see pre-compliance activity. That pre-compliance activity may well be based on voluntary market standards. I think there's going to be, it's hard to know, from my point of view, it's hard to know how this will really play out, because we saw what happened with Waxman Markey pre-compliance, and it wasn't clear. There was a big spike in the voluntary market at that point when players thought there was going to be an opportunity to buy these credits and have them, grandfathered into Waxman Markey bill. And I think that there's my advice would be that I don't have a clear answer to give you. Perhaps Leslie may like to follow up with some comments on this, but I think that you need to closely, from a country perspective, follow what's happening and make some deliberations as to whether there will be an inclusion of voluntary market offsets according to a VCS standard, or what other standards are being used within the marketplace, and whether they will actually be able to be grandfathered into the UNFCCC agreement. Now, if you want a particular standard in the UNFCCC agreement and you want to be able to grandfather credits in, it's going to have to meet, best practice international standard that's part of the UNFCCC agreement. So I think it's then the onus becomes on you. But I think we should get a comment from Leslie, because she's probably a lot closer to this than me.
Well, Nick, I think what you explained is the really pragmatic and very reasonable and fair way to approach it. But given what we've seen under the Warsaw Framework for REDD, given the way they prescribe the setting of reference emission levels, the way subnational is only for a certain period of time, and there's only one voluntary standard that even could be used at subnational and national level, I would say that although I think that approach is a really important approach, I suspect it's like starting from scratch. That doesn't necessarily mean you can't use 90% of what you've done to meet the Carbon Fund, for example's methodological framework, and make sure that you're not double counting and still deliver emission reductions into whatever the final UNFCCC protocols are. But I think it's unfortunately unlikely that there'll be early action standards that'll be adopted. If that,
Makes sense to me.
Dick, I did have, sorry, now that I have
Yep,
Mike,
no,
I have one question. I think you made a good point on aviation, and that has been on our radar for a couple of years, and it's very nice to see that progress is being made towards the MB market-based
I forget what it's called, but that's it.
But I think I guess I want to reiterate, it's more than a question, that countries who have, or even countries within a region that have airlines, most of those airlines are part of that international industry group that has made the commitment that Nick put up. Those could, and the numbers are fairly significant. You should be talking to those people. And that might be, promoting what Nick called offsetting, which goes everywhere from Microsoft buying a few tons here or there to a large industry who's made a very big commitment to, at least close to commitment to use offsets, and is looking at REDD and is publicly looking at REDD. Those are the kinds of relationships that as governments you should be building. So I just wanted to reiterate that point.
No, and I think from your country perspectives, it really is important to be making sure that your national airlines, as part of these negotiations, are putting forward your national perspective on the use of offsets and offsetting of REDD. And there are different issues you can raise. Obviously, there's the role of REDD in it, but whether you should be pushing for an earlier start date for the offsetting as a counterbalance, because at the moment we wouldn't start offsetting until, in effect, 2021, which means we're pushing it out quite a few more years. So, offsetting based on 2019 values could be something that might be an attractive thing to discuss. And maybe your national carriers will have a view that is more pragmatic than mine, but I think it's something definitely to be thinking of. Other questions?
Hi. So I was really, it was a very helpful summary of some quite complex demand dynamics, but I have a markets background, but it strikes me that there's a huge amount of uncertainty here about demand and putting the value that Leslie described yesterday we needed to put on carbon. And realistically, for tropical forest governments to make ambitious REDD+ plans and commitment of domestic resources over the next decade based on the potential for some of these fairly obscure potential sources of demand to materialize seems to me to be fundamentally an unrealistic thing for a country to do. And so it feels to me like it's very much beholden on the international governments and institutions like the Carbon Fund of the World Bank and the UN Green Climate Fund to step up to the plate and provide public results-based financing frameworks in the meantime, because this blue sky stuff is not something anybody could realistically make an investment decision on that basis. And it may be, and I wonder what you think of this, whether the results-based financing or the payments for results model that's being used could take the form of a floor price or put option that could at least allow forest country governments the potential to sell credits into a future high demand scenario where one to exist, but doesn't expect them to rely on that demand potentially materializing.
I think that you raised some really good points. I wouldn't be comfortable in suggesting to anybody that they should make major investment decisions based on the blue sky scenario, but I think what the blue sky scenario is trying to do is give you an idea of the nascent demand in the system, and the purpose is to try to set the UNFCCC framework so that if and when down the track countries get on board with doing more around abating their emissions, that REDD+ is going to be part of that scenario, which is why it's important to look at this now, because you've got these negotiations going on currently. Now, whether we're going to see a major change in the behaviour of the US in terms of moving towards a national cap and trade scheme within the next 2 to 3 years, it's absolute not a pure speculation. But that there is the precondition and there is the determination at the federal level to do something about emissions is abundantly clear from the EPA's Clean Air Act rules. Now that is likely to have side effects in terms of pushing states into one of those three buckets that I mentioned, the bucket where we just shut down production and replace it with natural gas, where we move to a REGI-like system, or we sort of coalesce around a California-style system. Now, I think if there's coalescence around California, there is going to be the opportunity for expanded demand. Now, California, I think one of the things that California is doing, and it's serious. I think the Climate Action Reserve is now trialling REDD+ methodologies in Mexico. I believe that's correct. So I mean, I don't think that I don't think that it's completely right to be pessimistic about these sources of demands. I think that there's potential there. I think, though, that you're also absolutely right in suggesting that we have to make sure that there's a base level of demand coming from the different funds. Without that base demand, we're not going to be in a position to scale things up if more demand comes on down the track. So I would agree. Now, whether, you know, your concept of using the put option and so on is the way to go, I think that deserves more discussion and certainly more thought on my part, but it certainly sounds like a good idea to me. So maybe I'll let Leslie make a comment.
Well, I agree with everything you guys said, and especially after having talked to thousands of investors to try to get them to provide money to invest in emissions that will have some value in the future. But the signaling part that Nick brought up, and that's where country participants can really help themselves help build demand. So just simply getting the word offset into any one of the decisions, or REDD offsets, those kinds of signals, even if they're not formally in the decision but are on submission, start to signal to some investors that are willing to take more risk than sort of the larger institutional investors that there can be recognition for a REDD offset within UNFCCC, because it does open doors. And hopefully you can also help avoid the situation that happened with ARR in the CDM, where the EU ETS said, oh, great, all CERs are wonderful except for ARR. So having your negotiators having those points in the back of their mind to try to get the term offset for REDD and try to make sure that countries can't just pick and choose, that it needs to be part of it. Those are important things, and they will signal to some investors that there is a chance that some of these scenarios might pan out. That's
I think my follow-up point with this would be that, you know, the bottom line with any of these future demand scenarios is getting the high abatement cost countries like the US, Australia, China, India eventually, Japan, Korea, all of these countries, these sort of higher cost abatements, Canada be another example, they all need to move to reduce emissions. So I think that showing willingness and flexibility as well on your domestic fronts to start to act sends strong signals that the developed countries that obviously need to do more won't be without partners in moving forward. So I think that the signals coming from Mexico are really positive, and the linkage with California, you know, it's starting to look like the basis of a future US national system. And you've got Quebec joining in. Quebec's model would ultimately, you would think, become the framework for Canada. So I honestly don't think that pessimism is warranted here. We've got a big problem. The problem's not going away. More things are going to happen that will cause governments to reconsider their positions. At the moment, we're in this weird spot where, you know, Australia's walked away from its commitments and other countries are unwilling to move forward. Europe doesn't want to significantly increase any supply of credits into its system because it's already over-allocated. But that's just a here and now perspective. I think as things change, we're going to see more of a movement forward and more of a determination to do something. So I guess I'm not wildly optimistic, but I'm sort of more on the optimistic camp, I would say, sooner than the pessimistic camp on it. But absolutely you need demand from the carbon funds. Any other questions?
Bueno, creo que Nick se merece un buen aplauso por su presentación muy ilustrativa. Seguimos con nuestra siguiente presentación.